I'm happy to introduce our keynote speaker for this conference, who is someone who really probably needs no introduction to most of you. He's both in terms of his thinking and his legislative action, been very engaged on the issues that we're talking about today, both war and peace and the constitutional war powers of Congress. Senator Rand Paul is one of the nation's leading advocates for liberty. He was first elected to the U.S. Senate from Kentucky in the 2010 election cycle. He has been a champion for limited government and fiscal responsibility and the constitutional boundaries of the federal government. He is an ophthalmologist who, in his spare time, provides pro bono eye surgery for people in need. And we are grateful that he is here. He has, at times, through his filibusters and his speeches and his legislation, been able to swing public opinion on some of these key issues. And if you don't all want to stand for Rand, I hope you will all sit and listen to what he has to say. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. Thanks to American Conservative for being a reasonable, rational voice in the foreign policy sphere and other spheres. I am a lot of times causing trouble up here, and so today when I leave, I will go to cause trouble on the floor because we discovered about a little over a year ago that the Arms Export Control Act of 1976 allows one senator to object to arms sales, and so I will. I began objecting about a year ago, and I got somebody on the other side, and sometimes things in foreign policy can bring the right and left together. Chris Murphy and I worked together on trying to stop an arms sale to Saudi Arabia about a year ago. We lost. I'm used to losing, but you don't always win the initial fight, but you can also influence opinion over time, and I think opinion is changing over whether or not we should be arming Saudi Arabia. Now, they did some of it themselves, by chopping up a dissident, which wasn't really probably the best for their public relations. But the first time we had the vote, we got about 22 votes to say we shouldn't advance them in another arms sale. The last time we got 47 votes. Now, what's happening now is they're not announcing any sales. You remember the president went to Saudi Arabia. He says we're going to have $350 billion in sales. They haven't announced any. And so my theory is they're not going to announce any until this cools off. So it could be a year, but that's another year of the war in Yemen. And my main objection to this whole thing is that the war in Yemen is a tragedy like most wars, but it's a particular tragedy because they're one of the poorest countries on the planet. They import 80% of their food. Even without war, half their population lives on the edge of starvation. With war, it may be 80% of their population lives on the edge of starvation. Said that 17 million people live on the cusp of starvation. They had 1 million people last year affected by cholera, things that don't happen in the modern world really anymore. And so I think it is something that we should not be participating in. And besides, there is this old-fashioned notion that we should actually vote before we go to war. So Mike Lee and Bernie Sanders promoted this idea that we should bring up, which is also a privileged motion, and we haven't been using any of these things. They brought up the War Powers Act. And with the War Powers Act, we actually had a vote. We still lost once again, but once again drawing attention. Some people say, oh, you shouldn't bring things up because if you lose, that defeats your battle. Well, if nobody brings it up, nobody talks about it. So I'm of the opinion we bring it up, win or lose, and that we can influence public opinion over time. With the War Powers Act, though, they brought it up and said, there's been no notification. So you know what the administration said? That's this administration. They said, well, bombs are not war. Bombs are not hostilities. And even if we are in hostile relations in Yemen, it's only with al-Qaeda. Well, my point, and this is where I differed a little bit on the resolution, is we haven't approved a war against al-Qaeda in Yemen either. We should vote on that as well. If you think it's a good idea, fine, but your representatives should vote on this. We aren't voting on any of this. So I stood up in my caucus yesterday, and of course, we will be opposed by the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, probably the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, and probably half of them or more. But I stood up and said, look, this is a proxy vote. The vote I will force this morning is a proxy vote on whether or not we should be participating at the war in Yemen. My preference would be to have an up or down vote on whether or not we were at war with Yemen or at war with the Houthis in Yemen or at war with some faction in Yemen. But I can't force that vote. So most of you who watch the Senate know that you can't force any vote you want to vote. You can just occasionally do it if it's mandated by law. So I can only force a mandated vote, and Saudi Arabia's arms aren't up, so it's actually going to be on Bahrain. You say, well, why are you trying to stop arms sale to Bahrain? Because they're part of the Saudi coalition. Saudi coalition has about 14 different countries that are involved in this. Bahrain's more of a minor player, but they are supplying air support, and several of these countries have hired mercenaries as well. It's an indirect way of bringing this subject up. But everyone will probably push back and say, well, Bahrain's been our ally, and our Navy's there and everything. My response to them is, I'm not asking you to pull the Navy out. I'm not asking you to divorce them as an ally. I'm asking you to block one arms sale. And to tell you the truth, if you really wanted to send them a message, and I don't think the arms sale is a good idea anyway, but if you thought it was a good idea, block it for now. Let's send them the message. Let's call in their ambassador and say, the war needs to end. And guess what? Since I started agitating on this, I'm not the only one saying that. Mattis has now said this. Pompeo has said this. Others are now saying it. We just in the last week quit refueling the planes going into Saudi Arabia. Now, the war hasn't stopped, but public opinion has turned against Saudi Arabia. So yesterday I present this, and a particularly snarky Republican senator, who I won't name, looks back at me and he says, well, what about Iran? You're not willing to fight with Saudi Arabia against Iran? And I said, frankly, I'm not so sure. I'm not sure who is more evil, Iran or Saudi Arabia. I'm not, you know. If you look at it objectively, if you look at the perniciousness of feeding an ideology that hates the West, hates Christianity, hates Hinduism, that's not part of the West, but they also hate Hindus, they hate Jews, this hatred, it comes from a form or a bastardization of Islam. But most of that form has come from Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is said to have spent $100 billion spreading this. They've been to Indonesia, the largest Muslim nation on the planet, which is said to have always had a relatively moderate form of Islam. Most of them still do. But who's spreading the hatred and the violence and the idea that violent jihad's a good idea? Saudi Arabia. They spent $2 billion in India. People say, well, India doesn't have many Muslims. Guess what? India has the second largest amount in the world. They have 10% of their population, but they have 1 billion people. So the second largest Muslim nation is India. Who's spreading the radicalization and the idea that it's fine to kill Christians, kill tourists, kill anybody? It's Saudi Arabia. You go to Pakistan, there's some estimate between 20 and 40,000 madrasas in Pakistan, all funded by the Saudis. So if you ask me who is the worst at sort of spreading hatred and sort of trying to engender terrorism around the world, it's Saudi Arabia, hands down. And if you say which peoples are probably more likely to come to Western ways and more likely to trade with us and like sort of trading with the West, it's probably Iran. I mean, their people were more Europeanized, that may be a bad way of putting it, but they were more open to the West, I think, than they have been in Saudi Arabia. And then some say, well, why don't we just sanction? And that's what's going on now. Today, the president's going to put sanctions on. To me, sanctions are a way of pretending to do something and doing nothing. All right? So there's 18 people that were involved with the assassination of Khashoggi. They're all in jail. So we're going to put sanctions saying they can't travel to the U.S. and we're going to freeze any of their accounts over here. They're all underlings. They're not going to put any sanctions on the Crown Prince, is my guess. The sanctions are going to be on the underlings. And already yesterday, another Republican senator who won't be named was extolling what a great modernizer this guy is and what a wonderful leader he is. And of course he's not a diplomat. You're crazy to think that they're a Democrat. You're crazy to think that these people will believe in human rights. They don't believe in human rights, but he's a modernizer, and he's our modernizer, and he will stand up to Iran. So this is really always the choice that we're always given, the choice of the lesser of two evils. But I'm convinced that there is a majority of the American people who believes, as I do and as many of you do, that we've been at war too long and too many places. I think there is a possibility for changing things, and I will continue to agitate on that. I think it is one of the statements that has stuck with me in the last year is I was reading Stephen Cole's book, Directorate S, about Pakistan and the Afghan War. And in it, he talks of Richard Holbrooke writing like a 10-page memo to the Obama administration, which I think was ignored. But the first item he writes is he writes all about how there is no military solution to Afghanistan. So this is in like 2009. So he writes this big, long memo why there's no military solution, but then he advocates for the surge as point number 2. And this is what's been going on and still going on. You can't find a foreign policy person, Republican, Democrat, or Independent, who thinks that there's a military solution to Afghanistan. In fact, if you ask them, is there a military solution to Yemen, they don't think there is. In fact, for probably at least 5 years, people have been saying there's no military solution to Syria, and yet we still react with a military response when we say there's no military solution. So I think there is an opening here for us. And I continue to ask those questions. What's the military solution? If it's not a military solution, why are we sending more troops? I remember I was with the president right after they decided to send some more troops into Afghanistan, and he said, well, McMaster's wanted to send 100,000 in or 90,000 in, and I forced it down to a smaller number. So people wonder, where is the president's heart, where are the president's ideas on this? I think the president's inclinations are less interventionist. You know, the one thing he says over and over again, and I think he truly believes, is the Iraq War was a geopolitical mistake, and also just it's a mistake to go in and have these big land wars to replace people in the Middle East. I think he truly believes that. What was his first instinct after Syria, after ISIS essentially was defeated? That we shouldn't stay permanently. These are good instincts, and I think these are instincts that those of us who want that to happen should applaud. And yet, the people surrounding him, who he has picked, usually want to stay. But even some of those who want to stay are not as unreasonable voices as you would think. I think Mattis is actually a reasonable voice, and probably would, if he were standing here, would tell you, and they are. You hear them saying this publicly now, that there's no real military solution in Yemen. It's time to bring the war to a close. But what happens around here is nobody's willing to do enough to actually push Saudi Arabia to do it. People say, if you don't sell them arms, Russia and China will. Well, they have all American planes. If they want to fly their American planes with fixing them with Russian parts, let them do it, all right? There'll be a quicker end to their Air Force than we could ever have imagined. But the thing is I've been told that they need replacement parts for planes every couple of months. I mean, planes are always being repaired. They also, I think, utilize our expertise. I'm not positive of this, but I think our mechanics help repair their planes. We train their pilots. So they're completely dependent on us. And I like this better than the idea of sanctioning, because I think sanctioning doesn't necessarily work. Also, I think, as some of you have written, and I know as my father has said, sanctions are a form of war. So do we want to have an embargo on Saudi oil? I'm very unhappy with Saudi Arabia. I don't like what they're doing, spreading messages throughout the world, but I wouldn't have an embargo of Saudi Arabia. I'm not for not trading with them. I think really we should continue to trade with Saudi Arabia. So really, if you're talking about what's the least disruptive, is let's just don't reward them with weapons. And you could even say, if you really want to give them weapons, just delay giving them weapons until they end the war. The war could come to a conclusion. Which brings me to sort of the idea, there's been so much written, probably for decades now, about how we're going to figure out the Middle East peace question. And everybody says it's about Palestine and about the Palestinians and the Israelis. And I was like, well, yeah, but really I start to think that the bigger peace issue is between Sunni and Shia. It's a 1,000-year-old war, and it's really the main proxies are Saudi Arabia and Iran. And so when people say, to Iran, the president tore up the Iranian agreement, even though I wasn't perfectly in love with the Iranian agreement, I would have built upon it and made it better or tried to add to it. I think it's easier to add to things than to start over, because we had an agreement, was working on the nuclear issues. But here's the problem. We're unhappy about Iran and ballistic missiles. Well, yeah, but why do you think they developed ballistic missiles? Because Saudi Arabia has ballistic missiles. Now, the problem really is its action and reaction between the two. So if we give $350 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia, what does Iran do? They've got to make deals too. So they've got to go to Russia and China to get deals as well. There is an arms race over there. And there's an action and a reaction. But the real peace treaty, and if you want to have a treaty with Iran, I predict there's no way they will ever give up their ballistic missiles, sort of having them taken from them. They see it as their self-defense, and I'm not justifying them as a country or the government. I'm just saying they see it as their self-defense. They're not going to give up their ballistic missile weapons. However, if you really wanted it to happen, you'd have to have a grand peace agreement or grand peace discussion, but it would have to be Saudi Arabia at the table and Iran at the table. So when Pompeo came in recently, he said, we've torn up the agreement and have these 12 points that Iran will have to agree to. And I said, well, you could mark out Iran and put Saudi Arabia for each one of those, or you could say Iran and Saudi Arabia for each of your 12 points. Then you might have something. But they're not really willing to do that. They see it as all one-sided. It's all about Iran, and it's nothing about the other. They really don't see it in context of that this is a sort of a bipolar world over there, and we've got people, they're all sort of the proxies for the Sunni Shia, but then there's proxies for proxies because then we become the proxy of Saudi Arabia, et cetera. So I think there are things we can do better, but a lot of it really comes back to how should we be doing it? Is this a unilateral decision we leave to the president, or is this something that our founding fathers and the Constitution intended that Congress would discuss? And so when I enjoy giving my little mini speech to my colleagues, I remind them of what Madison said, and what Madison said was that the executive branch is most prone to war. Therefore, with studied care, we vested that power in the legislature. And all the way up through John Quincy Adams, as it was well known and adhered to, we tried to avoid foreign war. We were tired of all the European wars. We didn't want to be constantly at war. So there's a reason, I think, geopolitically wise, it's been a mistake to always be involved in war in the Middle East, because as we've toppled the iron men of the Middle East, we've gotten chaos, and I think terrorism blossoms in chaos. So every time it's not worked. We got rid of Hussein, you got a disaster there where more terrorists developed. They didn't really get rid of Assad, but we beat Assad back enough that he was weak enough that there was more chaos. Chaos flourished, and terrorism flourished in Syria. We did it in Libya as well. You get rid of Gaddafi, you get chaos, and you may say that Libya may be the largest breeding ground for terrorism now. So there's a geopolitical reason why we shouldn't always get involved and always think we know best with toppling leaders. There's a constitutional reason, because we're not supposed to do it legally. And I think you combine that together to say, well, maybe we really need to rethink our approach to foreign policy. And I'll end with this, and then we'll do some questions. I've tried very hard on a number of fronts to try to figure out how we can lessen conflict around the world. And the other area that I've had the audacity to tread in is into the relations with Russia. And I've been really amazed at how difficult this is going to be. Typically, like with nuclear arms negotiations, Democrats were more open to it than Republicans. But now nobody's open to anything. I mean, the Republicans really believe that we should be, we got to be tough, and that means more sanctions, more sanctions, more sanctions. And the Democrats believe exactly the same thing for a slightly different reason. The Democrats are mostly unhappy with Russia because it's a way to hate Trump. And so they think Trump might be too friendly, so they need to hate Russia even more. The problem is, Russia does things to engender our displeasure, killing ex-spies, invading other countries. Not saying that that's a good thing, but I do think that we have to think about having relations with another nuclear superpower. So while I didn't like tearing up the Iran agreement, I don't like tearing up INF or New START as well. These are complicated agreements that took years. When I was in Russia recently, I got to spend an hour with Gorbachev, which was an amazing meeting. And it really was a seminal achievement of Reagan and Gorbachev coming together and signing that treaty in 1987. And there need to be louder voices. I mean, people need to write about this. This needs to be out there. It needs to be a real discussion. We're just going to tear it up. We're just going to leave this treaty that Reagan and Gorbachev signed and start over. There is a disagreement, but we have to realize that in diplomacy, particularly with adversaries, you have to at least listen to their side of the story. I'm not saying Russia's correct, but you have to listen to them. They say that our anti-ballistic missile launchers in Romania and Poland, that they go against the strict details and interpretation of the INF Treaty. We say that their cruise missiles do. So we have a disagreement. We both are alleging a violation of it. But whenever I talk to the State Department or anybody else, they only say Russia's in violation and must come into compliance. I don't think that's how you start a negotiation. I think you have to hear them out. And so what I've advised when I came back from Russia is I advised both General Kelly and the president, why don't you name nuclear arms negotiators and let's begin hashing the details? Because details are very important on this. Some say that the INF Treaty was one of the best ever for verification. You remember Reagan saying, trust but verify? Apparently, we still have, and a lot of people don't know this, Russians come into our country with only a 24-hour notice to look at our missile silos. We do the same to them. They apparently call up, and I've heard this from senators out in the West that have these missile silos. They land in the airport in Los Angeles, and they call up and say, we'll be there in 24 hours. We actually have signs in Russian, directing you when you get close to the silo, turn left here if you're the Russian inspector. And so, but it seems to have worked. And in fact, I heard somebody the other day who said that they were so opposed to the Iran agreement, but they would have been for it had we had the same verification in it that we had in the INF Treaty. And these are all things that I think could be discussed, how we have better verification in our treaties. But I think the bottom line is things are very, very bad, and some of it's politicized, but we can't have any kind of reasonable discussion right now with Russia. I tried to do one thing. I tried to lessen the sanctions on Russian legislators. And they're like, oh, they're all just puppets. The Duma and the Federation, they're all just puppets of Putin. Maybe. But maybe there's somebody who is the next Gorbachev who happens to be in the Duma, and he or she is working their way up the party leadership and might be somebody who can end the tension and turn the country around and bring back more democracy to Russia. But we won't know that if we don't ever talk to them. And I tell the Democrats, you want to complain about the election, you want to complain about them meddling in our elections, if you don't let them travel here and you don't visit them, you can't even complain to them. And I don't think we should sanction diplomacy. That's what sanctioning the legislature does. So I introduced it. You know how many votes I got? I lost 20-1 in the committee, 20-1. But, and many of them said, it was one Democrat senator that I visited, he said in private, he said, you're just going too fast. You got to wait for us to catch up. I was like, what does that mean? And it mainly means that they don't seem to be able to act in any way because of the electoral politics. They are so concerned about being anti-Trump that they can't think of anything else. There truly is a Trump derangement syndrome, and they're caught up in it. And in the end, even if Trump were more open to Russia, because he's been accused so much of it, there can be no advancement because he has to always feel like he has to be tougher on Russia. But I think there are ways that we can advance forward. But we got to think through a lot of things. For example, the gas pipeline that Russia has to Germany. Our whole State Department and the mantra of the State Department is that it's a bad idea. And I raised my hand and I said, why? Why would it be a bad idea for Germany to buy gas from Russia? And they're like, oh, we would rather them buy it from the U.S. Well, yeah, but we'll probably never be able to ship it across an ocean and sell it cheaper than it can come in a pipeline. And that's fine if they need more, if they'll buy some from us, good. But at the same time, isn't interdependence a good idea? Isn't it a good idea that China, it's not a good idea that we have so much debt, but isn't it a good idea that China owns about a third of our debt or something? Not that, I think they own a little over $1 trillion, but it keeps them interconnected, not really excited about like destroying our currency or destroying our country because they own our debt and we're interconnected. And they also, a large portion of their GDP is sold to us. But as we look around the world and we look at where things are going, we need to somehow get away from the politics of everything's about President Trump and start talking about foreign policy in I think, a more mature fashion. We need to reevaluate the Middle East and really the world and decide whether or not we have to be involved in everybody's war. And even if you don't agree with all of that, you have to reassess whether or not we've got enough money. We're spending $50 billion a year in Afghanistan. We built a $90 million hotel, luxury hotel in Kabul, never finished. 11 years later, it sits half empty, and it's a danger because we're worried the Taliban will crawl up in there and use it as a position for their snipers. So now we have to patrol this $90 million half-built hotel. The guy absconded with the rest of the money. It's not built to code. It's a piece of you-know-what. And you know what's going to happen to it? Thank you for the $90 million you sent, but we need a little more because we need some money to tear it down. So if you'll gladly send about another $200,000 or $300,000, I think we can get it torn down. Is that not an insult? We built a $45 million gas station. My staff went over there. We were the second oversight operation ever to go to Afghanistan, second in 17 years. Everybody else goes, and the generals say what a great war this is and why we need more troops and more money. We went to find out where the money was being spent. We couldn't visit the sites because they're too dangerous to visit. You cannot travel in Kabul by car more than a street or two. You go by gunship. If you wanted to visit the natural gas station that was supposed to cost $500,000, cost $45 million, you had to go with 300 Marines, and they didn't think it was a wise use of their Marines' lives to go visit this gas station. And I don't think it's a wise use of your money to spend it on a gas station if we can't even visit it. So it's just ridiculous. And this is one of the things I liked about the president. He says, let's do things here at home. Let's build infrastructure here at home. He says it, but somehow we have to do it. $50 billion is a lot of money. Can you imagine taking even $5 or $10 billion out of the 50 and putting it in an infrastructure fund and then saving the rest of it? If we leave, the Taliban will take over. They're taking over anyway. They live there. They've lived there for thousands of years. They're going to be there 1,000 years after we're gone. But the thing is we have to get away from this, they're going to win, the Taliban will win. No. In fact, when the president said he wanted a parade, I thought it was a dumb idea. But I said, you know what? I'm for it. If you bring everybody home from Afghanistan, I'll show up at the parade. I'd like to conclude by just saying that a lot of the problems on foreign policy, having a more modest, a more realistic foreign policy, would come simply by obeying the Constitution. Most of the power has been voluntarily given up to the president. But there is a resurgence, and there's a little bit of a right-left coming together on this. Mike Lee, Bernie Sanders, myself, Bernie Sanders, myself, Jeff Merkley. There are some people that are coming together to say, you know, we had too much war for too long. And so I think there is a possibility for it. I think intellectuals and writers can be a big help to us by talking about this, because I think there's not enough discussion of this. And if you want to hear my complaint about the media, all we ever talk about is just nonsense, over and over again. Trump said this or Trump tweeted this. When we talk about the war in Yemen, when we talk about whether it's a good idea to be in Yemen, we don't talk about any of that. So the media is just as much at fault. They want to criticize him and his demeanor and all his the things he does with Twitter. Why don't you step up to the plate, blank network, and talk about real issues? We don't have that discussion. But I do think there is some room for encouragement, in the sense that I think that there is a right-left movement out there talking about a more realistic foreign policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. We have 2 microphones on each end, so there's one coming right behind you, sir.
If you'll let me know who you are and what you do, that'd be great, too.
Paul, Don Rosenberg, National Chairman, National Traditionalist Caucus. Would you also be, I commend your action on Saudi Arabia, would you also be in favor of blocking an arms sale to the Ukraine, which is an illegitimate regime, which persecutes its own people and is supported by security forces, some of which are outright neo-Nazi?
You know, it's a difficult question, you know, what to do in Ukraine. You're talking about not supporting the current regime. You know, the problem with so many of these areas of conflict that we get involved with is that there's a long history of corruption, and there is in Ukraine. And if you go back, whether it's a pro sort of European Ukrainian leader or a pro-Russian leader, there's allegations of corruption on both sides with each of the governments. At the same time, I'm open to the argument that, well, gosh, isn't it a terrible thing that the Russians have, you know, invaded the eastern part of the country? And so I think that I'm not sure I know the exact answer to you. I have actually voted to allow some arms to go to the regime, but in general, I'm wary of the idea that we get involved in more conflict, including Ukraine. I do think that it's a reason why we should talk to the Russians, because if you don't talk to the Russians, you're not going to get a resolution. But I think the discussion, I think that you could convince the Russians, and this is what I told them when I talked to them, and here's the way they respond. They respond in a very nationalistic way, and they say, we are never doing anything you tell us to do because of the sanctions. Sort of like being in grade school. We're not doing it if you tell us to do it. So really, I think diplomacy is us explaining to them that it's in their best interest. And I think there is an argument to be made, if it also included us lessening sanctions on Russia, that if they were to sign a peace treaty for and disengaged from the eastern part of Ukraine, that you could actually have a peaceful agreement. But Russia has to be involved with that, and you have to have a discussion of that. I don't think they're ever leaving Crimea. So if we're waiting for them to leave Crimea to remove sanctions, well, the sanctions will remain forever. Anybody else?
Senator Paul, my name is Sridhar Parsi. I'm the founder of the National Iranian-American Council. Tremendously refreshing to hear your views on foreign policy. You mentioned that you wanted to build on the Iran nuclear deal, that would have been a better way. And I would agree with you, because that was largely the idea with it, that this would be the first necessary step. And after that, the many other conflicts and issues between the US and Iran could be addressed diplomatically. And another benefit of it was that it actually would reduce America's reliance and dependence on Saudi Arabia and give the US more options in the region. Given that, would you support, assuming that the next administration in 2020 will not be as hostile to the Iran nuclear deal, if it survives for the next 2 years, would you support an American re-entry into the Iran deal?
Yes. And I would have done some things a little bit differently. I probably would have released the money slower. And actually, I think there is still some argument that some of the money hasn't been released. That I probably would have done differently. But I think if they're adhering to it all throughout us getting out of it, that's a good sign that we should go and then build upon it. I don't think we can build upon it, though, unless there's some sort of bilateral agreement that also includes Saudi Arabia as well. I also have come to the opinion stronger and stronger that we should trade with Iran. Everybody says it. The people of Iran don't hate America. The people of Iran like a lot of the things we have, movies and music and things like that, and I think are very open. It doesn't, from what I hear, doesn't seem to be a backward society where women are treated the way they are in Saudi Arabia. And so I think that we should, it becomes a whole Cuban argument over again. And I think one of the interesting things about Cuba is most of the Cuban expatriates still are for the embargo to this day. And yet you talk to a lot of Iranians who came here, and many of them came here in '79, and I'm sure you have no love lost for the government of Iran. No Iranian American I've met has any love lost. They don't like the government, and yet a lot of them are for the Iran agreement. So it must make you think that people who actually still care about the people of Iran actually do want to see some sort of lessening of tensions. And I don't know, almost everybody around here is of the opposite opinion, though. You look at the Foreign Relations Committee, the Republicans are hardliners. You look at the top people on the Democrat side, they're hardliners. If you go down the seniority chain, you get to some more realistic views on both sides, which my dad always told me, when you look at the committees, the people at the very top are almost identical no matter which party they're from. You have to look for anybody that believes in anything. You have to go way down the seniority levels, because they've also been here a shorter time and still believe in something. But I think there is hope for it, but I don't know exactly. It's not just a new president. I mean, if you have a bill for more sanctions on Iran right now, I'll bet you get 98 votes for it. So that's what I mean. People think if you're not for more sanctions, you're not against the Ayatollah. I'm against all forms of authoritarian government. I think the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is an authoritarian government. I think the Ayatollah is a religious authoritarian, and the Revolutionary Guard are. And but I don't think that any of us think that war with Iran and invading Iran and trying to give them what we have is the answer to it. So what's the only other way? Are sanctions going to make them get there? Some think we'll cripple Iran with sanctions. I think they've suffered from sanctions before when they were universal. When we had the big 6 countries doing it and the world involved. Now it's going to be mostly us. I'm pretty sure Iran will probably be able to evade that. And if there's hardship in Iran, the same way there's hardship in Cuba, who do you think Castro blamed? The U.S. So if anything, people come together as a people when they feel that someone's picking on them or doing something against them. I think I have time for maybe one more right here. Here's the microphone.
Thank you for coming. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, Reagan Foundation. In my opinion, North Korea will never, ever give up their nuclear program. Should we impose more sanctions? Thank you.
I'm kind of with you that I'm doubtful that they will. I am, even when doubtful about things, encouraged somewhat by dialogue. So I think Trump did the right thing talking to them. And so I would continue that dialogue. There's a little more thawing of dialogue between South Korea and North Korea. I agree with you. I think that they will play a duplicitous game with us. They've done it in the past. I wouldn't give them any money. I wouldn't give them any food. I have voted for sanctions on North Korea. But at the same time, I think ultimately something's going to have to happen within North Korea. They will have to choose a new leader. They won't do it through an election. You can imagine how they must do it, but I think that's your only hope for change. The other thing is if you can get information, if they could see the information, if you could, you've seen the pictures, I'm sure you have the two Koreas at night, the satellite photo, all the electricity and all the energy in South Korea and the amazing amount of wealth in South Korea that comes from freedom and trade. I just don't know how anybody could reject that, but I think it's such a closed society that in North Korea, a lot of that, it's hard for people to get that information, but I can't imagine they live so close that they can't almost sense the wealth of the people to the south of them. But people wondered forever, how did the Russians put up with Stalin? Why didn't someone take care of Stalin, one of his lieutenants or generals? And it went on and on and on. And there's a certain ruthlessness that keeps people in check. I mean, he's killed members of his family. He killed like a half-brother somewhere, like in Manila airports. I mean, that kind of ruthlessness really, keeps people in check. I don't know what the ultimate answer is, though, but I agree with you that we should be suspicious of them, but I still would talk to them. Maybe one more.
Maybe I can be heard over a microphone. Senator Paul, I'm William Dalton. I'm from North Carolina. I was one of your father's delegates to the 2012 Republican National Convention.
Thank you.
You had mentioned earlier the obsession in Washington over Russian interference in American elections.
Right.
I wonder if you might reflect how the evidence of that interference compares to the evidence of America's interference in Russian, Ukrainian, and Georgian elections, and of the influence that the nation of Israel tries to bear upon American elections.
Well, if you look at cover of Time magazine in 1996, it's a picture of 2 or 3 political activists that were big time over there spending millions of dollars on Yeltsin's election. There were rumors that IMF money, like some $10 billion loan, that a significant amount of that he was just personally using on his re-election campaign. So yes, we have been involved. And the moment you say that, the other side jumps up in arms and says, you're saying we're morally equivalent with the Russians and we're not. And I think the problem is you have to admit the truth. We have been involved in elections. Were we a little bit involved in getting rid of Mossadegh in Iran in 1954? Yes. Has our CIA been involved with toppling governments around the world over the last 50 or 60 years? Yes. So yes, we ought to admit that we have been involved also. But I think the thing is that, and the Russians sort of laugh at our obsession with this. The reason they laugh is they sort of chortle and they say, well, I guess your democracy is so weak that we brought you down with $50,000 worth of Facebook ads, and it's like, and I kind of like the president's response. The president got like 75% in Appalachia, on the Virginia side and the Kentucky side, which is very good to get 75% of the vote anywhere. And he goes out there and he has a rally with 10,000 people and he says, how many of you voted for me because the Russians told you? It's like, no, they voted for him because Hillary Clinton said she was going to regulate the coal business, the coal companies out of business and was going to take your job. And people were offended by that kind of rhetoric. But, Americans try to steal elections as well. I mean, we've had graft and theft in our elections. Used to be really bad. I mean, it's a lot better than it's ever been. The elections are probably more honest than they've ever been. But we still do have to be careful, I think, with the centralization of these. And like everything else, the government's probably going to spend billions of dollars trying to fix it. And really, here's how you fix it. You have a paper ballot. You keep them with a stack of them with a number on them. And when the votes are recorded, a Republican and a Democrat, maybe a Libertarian, watch the counting of the votes. And as you watch the counting of the votes and you look at the signatures, and if 2,000 people signed in, the votes have to add up to 2,000. And when you put that on the internet or you send it somewhere, you have a copy, and your job is once it gets posted on the state site, you look to make sure the numbers on the state side are the same as the ones you hand counted. So election integrity is not that hard, but we've had a lot of corruption in our country. I don't think any foreign country has ever really probably changed a vote in our country, but we've had people from both parties steal elections by stuffing ballot boxes. One of the most famous people in Kentucky was a guy named Pritchard. He went to jail for stealing an election, and we named an education commission after him. He's the Pritchard Education Commission, even though he spent time in jail for stealing an election. But yeah, we need to get beyond some of this stuff, and it would help if the Mueller investigation would end, and then we can kind of begin debating policy again. Thank you very much for having me.